Thank you so much, Barry, for that lovely introduction. I guess it is a life-changing moment. I joined the BBC in 1983. I've been there ever since. Now suddenly I've left it and come back to Cambridge. And to what a job, Master of Cambridge's oldest college. Lots of people say, so what are you going to be called then? Well, it's definitely Master. My two brothers said, oh yeah, you've got to be called Master, Bridget. It sounds like something out of Doctor Who. Although as far as I remember from the Doctor Who TV series, the Master is always the baddie. But that said, in Peterhouse, I'm very definitely Master. I'm getting used to it. So I wanted to talk today both about myself, but also about the world we live in. Because, let's face it, these are extraordinarily uncertain times. The world's more interconnected than ever, in trade and technology and relatively cheap travel and digital communications. There are more efficiencies, there are more possibilities, there are links which leapfrog over old boundaries in ways just a few years ago we would have thought would have been in the realm of science fiction. And yet, it's also an era of increasing sense of risk and danger and confusion, whether from terrorism or cybercrime or social and economic pressures. And that feeling many people seem to share of an increasing loss of personal control and the erosion of personal security. And we've seen it in this part of the world in the recent political shocks that we've had. So the polls no longer seem to be able to prepare us for outcomes of elections or adequately explain them. The outcome of the last British election, which was called wrong, the rise of populism we've seen in lots of countries in Europe, the unexpected groundswell of support in the primaries in the United States that makes Donald Trump look like the Republican likely choice for president, and of course the Brexit vote just recently here in the UK. It seems as though it's all reflecting a new mood, a certain class of voters who feel that life is so impoverished or opportunities so limited and frustrating that there's no longer any point in being risk-averse and remaining with the status quo. It seems these are people who often now distrust governments and policymakers and the elites and experts who work closely with them. And even if these people deliver rational, sensible explanations, they're no longer believed. Or the people who are listening no longer want to act according to reason. They rather resort to emotion. And of course, if not addressed, these tendencies, lack of trust, gap, this sort of gap which can open up in society, can be dangerous. If populations or segments of population no longer trust those who govern them to represent their best interests, what do we get? Well, we saw it overnight in an attempted coup in Turkey. But if you think about the Brexit vote here, or the angry Trump supporters in America, if these are people for whom the future seems to offer little promise, what they're saying is, what's there to lose in pushing for change? Why not vote for radical options or candidates who may lead to unpredictable consequences, but which also might hold the promise of new empowerment and making a fresh start? Of course, there are lots of interconnected reasons for this, causes. I'm not trying to give a full analysis here. But certainly we can see the symptoms of this sort of disenchantment and dislocation here in the UK today. So that Scottish referendum, I remember very well. I was still working for the BBC. We went to bed on Thursday night, and we didn't know when we woke up on Friday morning if a large chunk of the north of this British island would suddenly be broken off. Then there was the shock of the Brexit vote. Again, I think a lot of people went to bed. In fact, I think quite a lot of people thought in the middle of the night they thought they knew what was going to happen, went to sleep thinking they knew the outcome, woke up in the morning and it was the opposite outcome. Lots of uncertainties about what it might do and where it might lead. And let's see what happens in the United States in November. Given this context, I'm making no predictions. And of course, it raises the possibilities here in the UK, among our friends and allies, abroad and further afield across the whole globe, that there will be more profound shocks around the corner, almost impossible to predict, and very hard to plan for the consequences. Brexit. We all know there's deep concern of some here in this university about the impact of Brexit on EU funding of research projects and the future of some students. The new Prime Minister and Cabinet has been announced earlier than expected. That has to be a good start, but there's still so much to be clarified. There has been a very clear message from the very top of this university that this may be a challenging time, but Cambridge will pursue its links with Europe as indeed with other parts of the world, and remain open for business as usual. This is a global university. Its commitment to education and research will only be reinforced by changing circumstances around it. We need to attract and collaborate with the very best in the world, regardless of their nationality or background. And let's not forget that schemes like this, the Cambridge Gates Scholarships, is a timely reminder of why it's so important to resist tribalism and why we need to recognise how much we all benefit from sharing. Look at today, a conference where you all share in a free and frank environment with colleagues from all over the world, bringing different perspectives together so that you can take away new ideas and inspiration as you go home or continue your studies here. But this sense of uncertainty isn't just about Brexit. So this interconnectedness around the globe offers all this potential, but it seems to bring the prospect of peril closer too. It's as though time and space have been shrunk in the wash. So time, think of this week. It feels like events and history has been speeded up. First, there was a new British Prime Minister on Monday, weeks before it was supposed to happen after a Tory vote in September. Then the horrific terror attack in Nice in France, a new tactic of driving a lorry into a crowd of families, just the latest of a series of strikes to hit France, leaving us all reeling. And then the news of an attempted coup in Turkey overnight. I think all my BBC colleagues are completely exhausted by this bumper-to-bumper series of headline news. It feels as though 10 years has happened in less than a week. And for all of us, journalists, but listeners, consumers, it's overwhelming and difficult to process. There's a danger it leaves us exhausted with the desire to switch off and keep the world at bay, batten down the hatches, put on some soothing music and read a book, and just shut the door on everything. And that's time. Space is also crumpled. The sense of proximity that we all have, because many of us are travelling more, some living in several countries at once. And because information, especially visual information, which can have such an emotional impact, is also, we're not going out to places. This information is also coming back to us much more quickly. So the recent terror attack in Nice and other places, the report of last night's coup in Turkey, you get this now blow by blow from eyewitness reports on social media as it's happening. It's unfiltered, it's raw, it's emotional, it's distressing. When I was a teenager in the 1960s and 70s, I remember that Turkey felt like a remote destination here in Cambridge. Few people I knew had ever been there. It was actually a time of constant military coups in Turkey and turbulence, but it felt distant and mostly irrelevant to daily life in this country. There was a sense that nothing there could really happen that would shake the equilibrium here. And even France in the 1970s might have been next door, across the channel, but across the channel in those days was a much bigger space. There was no Channel Tunnel. It took a long time to get there. Airfares were expensive. It was a long-distance phone call away or an airmail letter, not a button on your iPhone or a quick switch on Skype. And news was much more distant too. When I joined the BBC in 1983, I was always interested in foreign news because of my background in modern languages. But I was constantly frustrated because it would take 2 days to get any satellite pictures of an event happening somewhere abroad back to the UK. And I'd be told, I'd say, we really should be doing this event in South Africa. And they'd say, no, we'll have to do it the day after tomorrow. We won't get the pictures yet on television. It's one reason I focused in the first part of my career on radio news, because on the radio you could report the news today, not in 2 days' time. You didn't need the pictures. Now, when we hear of a terror attack in France or Belgium or Istanbul, we see the images of the devastation and panic within minutes. We hear the eyewitnesses on the radio. Our personal connections are greater too. We search through our memories for relatives or associates who might be there on holiday or working. Or we think back to that vacation when we strolled down the Nice promenade or took a picture of the Blue Mosque in Turkey. We go on Facebook to look at the safety check to make sure that no one we know has been caught up in it. The potential personal connection to every horrific incident around the world is there now. In a good way, to know that loved ones are saved, but in a bad way too, because it pulls us in. It makes it all so personal and sometimes unbearable. And this can be the downside of interconnectedness. We're all closer now, but we're therefore all so much more vulnerable. And it can make the desire to pull up the drawbridge and insulate ourselves from outside threats to seem attractive. but it's also a reminder that we live in a much more integrated geographical space, which we all share, and actually, we do need to understand each other better, and we do all need to participate in shaping. And in that context, it seems to me, at this quite troubling time for lots of us, that more than ever, in this era of shocks and fast mutations, we need to be very clear about those fundamentals that we are certain of, the values we all share as human beings, which drive us, reassure and comfort us, which we mustn't lose sight of or stop cherishing. So, respect for each other, common humanity, value of every human life, the readiness to help those in need, the willingness to explore and embrace other viewpoints, even if we don't always agree with them. I was running over some thoughts for this talk at a recent meeting of heads of house, and one of the heads of house there was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who's head of Magdalen, as you, I'm sure, all know. And so I was talking to him about this, saying, I'm thinking of talking about this, but it does sound a bit like a sermon. And he said, oh, very good, preach away. It always sounds so much better when it doesn't come from a churchy person. Anyway, it's also entirely appropriate in front of all of you because the ethos of the Gates Fellowship is more important than ever. A project which aims to promote excellent scholars. All of you have had to excel in highly competitive application processes to get here, but also because it rewards and encourages a frame of mind which wants not just to take the opportunities and the funding offered by these scholarships, but also find a way, many ways, to give back. And I know lots of you, we heard from Bill Gates, are already walking the walk, engaged in exciting projects which are changing lives around the globe and are making a difference. But I also wanted to ponder on the question, which for me is a very personal question, of when people start out as young scholars doing masters and PhDs, how do you know whether what you're doing will create opportunities to give back and show leadership and make a difference? And sometimes it seems to me it's hard to see, it's not always clear what the obvious link will be between a very focused and academic field of scholarship and what's relevant for the rest of the world. And so this morning, I want to make a plea to all of you, to everyone, not to think too literally or narrowly about what could be useful, but have the confidence that whatever you're studying, if you're passionate about it and if you excel in it, you will probably find a way to turn it to wider use. So to illustrate that, I wanted to talk a bit about my own career. I started out as a Russian literature major at Oxford University. I know, the other place, sorry to mention it here. A niche subject, Russian literature, not that common, quite a small number of us studying it. And I must admit, when I was a student, not everyone I came across in my wider life could see the point of it. Along the way, I'd been a beneficiary of quite a few scholarships, as we heard. My first one in 1976 to 77 was to improve my Russian, and it involved a year in the Soviet provinces, which was an eye-opener, certainly for me, coming from Cambridge. I'd never quite clocked that people didn't all live in beautiful cities like this one. For the first 2 weeks, I was constantly getting lost going around this provincial city, Voronezh, because all the buildings looked the same. In those days, of course, we forget, in the Soviet Union, private enterprise was banned, so everything was programmed as the same. So if you went to a fruit and vegetable shop, it wasn't Sainsbury's or the Co-op, it was just frukty i ovoshi, fruit and vegetable. It really was very difficult to orientate yourself without all those commercial individual signs that stare out at us from our streets that actually we don't realize, but we use to orientate ourselves around a city. So that was year one. Then I went to the US for 2 years, as you heard, to Harvard, to kind of get another perspective on all of this. And then after a year in Oxford, I was back in Russia for a year in the early 80s in Moscow. So that's a lot of scholarships. I used to feel quite embarrassed about it. I used to joke, I was a sort of Chekhovian eternal student, Вечный студент, I think it's in The Cherry Orchard, if any of you know that play. And that this was all part of my Soviet-style 5-year economic plan. A year in Voronezh, and 2 years in the United States, back to Oxford, another year in Moscow. And I did feel it was rather a luxury to have all this travel and study paid for without having committed to any end goal of what I was going to do, which might promise a real payback. And all the more so because I chose for my postgraduate research to look into a Russian writer from the 1920s called Andrei Platonov, who's not exactly a household name here in the UK, or probably most parts of the world. He's very well known in Russia. But he is very complex. He writes in quite a difficult style. He's very hard to translate, although there is someone in Britain who's done a fantastic job at it, Robert Chandler. He writes in a veiled, half-ironic, half-agonized way about a very specific early Soviet period, about the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution on Russian people, which should have created a paradise, but ended up being a horrific, nightmarish experiment visited on the Russian people, which held the country back for decades. So quite esoteric. And actually, it was quite an esoteric subject, as a lot of PhD subjects can be. I'll never forget when I was in the midst of it, going to visit a friend in Zurich in Switzerland, and meeting a friend of a friend who said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm studying Soviet literature of the 1920s and 30s. And she said, why are you doing that? It's not even your native culture or your language. I mean, what's the point? And I did feel quite at a loss. I mean, if you don't get it immediately, how do you explain that Tolstoy and Pushkin and Dostoevsky and Chekhov, not to mention Mandelstam, Akhmatov, and Brodsky, they're all world-class writers and poets, and they can teach us a lot about ourselves and our place in the world? Or how do you explain that Russian literature, actually like any language and literature, is a doorway through which you can access another world that's not your own and broaden yourself? And in Russia's case, comprehension is vital because it's the biggest country in landmass terms in the world, and we seem to have a habit of falling out with it and seeing it as a threat, and it seeing us as a threat. So I don't think at that point I gave a very convincing answer. But actually, when I look back, what those scholarships and what that time gave me was carte blanche to follow what interested me, and definitely a gateway into a world which at that point was incredibly difficult to access, the Soviet Union. It was very hard to get there if you weren't a diplomat or in very narrow spheres, someone in gold mining and selling diamonds. You could probably get there, but most people could not. And what was happening was it wasn't just turning me into a Platonov specialist. This bedrock of knowledge that I gained of the inner workings of the Soviet Union, of its history and its rhythms, of the specifics of what make Russian people tick, of the gap between Moscow elites and the grim reality of the Russian provinces, was to prove absolutely invaluable for a 33 career in journalism. So I switched because in 1982, on the year of my last scholarship in Moscow, I was banned from the archives because my writer was rather ironic, and let's face it, they were anti-Soviet utopian works, and they didn't want me to find out more about them. So I set about trying to meet as many people as I could who might have met him or known him. He died in 1952, 53. And so I met hundreds of people. And it became clear to me that the moribund Soviet economy was teetering on the edge of collapse, that the politics was stagnating, that this was unsustainable, that Brezhnev was about to die, and that something momentous was about to happen. In fact, most of my Russian friends who'd come to the same conclusion thought the only possible way that this could end was badly, and it would be back to a return to the terror of the 1930s with the lid clamped down again as the party elite desperately tried to cling on to power through force and maybe violence. In fact, as we soon found out, my Moscow friends were wrong. The change of the old guard led in just a few years to Mikhail Gorbachev, perestroika, and within 6 years of him coming to power, the whole system collapsed. I didn't see that coming, but in 1982 I could feel that something was going to happen, so I wanted to move from the academic world to journalism to have a front row seat and watch it closely. So I joined the BBC, and over 30 years the BBC saw me as a useful resource on Russia, and over time I became one of their best-known Russian reporters and analysts. 5 years as Moscow correspondent, there to see the collapse of communism, the end of the Cold War, some of the most momentous years of the end of the 20th century. 5 years to complement that, covering Bill Clinton's presidency in Washington, to see how the other superpower reacted to the end of the loss of their Cold War foe, and then back here to the UK since 1998 as diplomatic correspondent. I thought, oh, well, diplomatic correspondent, that'll be all about peace and diplomacy. No, I didn't realize that the flip side of diplomacy is always war, so you end up covering all the kind of catastrophes and dramas and conflicts. And haven't we had a lot of them? The NATO campaign in Kosovo, the 9/11 attacks, the invasion of Iraq, Arab Spring, and now the new East-West debacle as Putin fell out with the West first over Georgia and then over Ukraine and his annexation of Crimea in 2014. And actually, looking back on it all, right from those early days when I started as a journalist, I was instinctively, maybe subconsciously, aware that I did have a privileged position from which to view Russia, such an important part of daily news in those days and actually still. From having lived there and experienced ordinary life and having seen it from the inside, I would find, in comparison to my journalistic colleagues, I'd often have quite a different response to things that were happening. And a lot of what that was an understanding that the situation wasn't black and white. It wasn't the evil empire, as President Reagan called it. It wasn't always aggressive and hostile in every situation. It was more complicated than that. Sometimes it was about fears, sometimes overinflated fears. Sometimes it was about their lack of understanding of what was happening here. And also because sometimes even the most ideological of party members were not always driven by conviction, but other not immediately obvious motives. I'll always remember in 1982, the director of studies I had at Moscow University, who banned me from all those archives, was a quite ferocious woman, someone that everyone was scared of. She was a really tough communist. But in the middle of the year, I came back to the UK to see my family, and I had to get her permission to do that. And at the end of the conversation, she said, by the way, you couldn't bring back a few LP records, could you, for my son? He's very keen on music. So, I would have liked her to let me go into those archives. Of course, I was delighted to bring back a few LPs, as they were in those days still, to see if it might make a difference. And she was very pleased, and she invited me around to her flat. And what I discovered was that these records were her for disabled son, who was quite evidently had quite severe special needs, needed constant attention, absolutely adored music. She was a single parent, middle-aged, she was devoted to him, and now it became completely clear why she towed the party line and was quite so fierce and impervious in her job at the university. It wasn't to do with political conviction at all. She was caring for a vulnerable son in a system which made almost no provision for mental impairment. Mostly people like that were locked away in asylums. And her political battle axe behaviour at the faculty was totally understandable. To survive in that world, you often had to master the art of doublethink. You had to be two people, never quite choosing between them. And I think about that a lot today as I look at Russia and meet people there, listen to some statement from Mr. Putin's spokesman, who I've known for many years, or the foreign minister, who I've also seen off and on over many years in many different incarnations. And you just think, to understand the politics of Putin's Russia, like Soviet Russia, you have to put yourself in the shoes of those people who surround him, who need to survive, and understand their motivation, and realize that there's still an important element of doublethink, of, as the Russians put it, mало ли что, who knows what will happen. Be like this, but leave open the possibility to be like that too. Gorbachev himself did it. I don't think when he started out he had any intention of the reforms going quite so radically. But he held both possibilities in mind for a long time. It's a separate conversation. One of his closest friends at university was Zdenek Mlynar, who was the architect of the Prague Spring, who came to see him in 1967 in provincial Russia when he was a star in the party rising up. How did that conversation go? This loyal communist, who a year later was to denounce the Prague Spring, who'd had a conversation with the man who was the architect of it privately in his southern Russian home. There was definitely doublethink going on there. So political science and international relations disciplines have a really useful role. I use them all the time. I enjoy very much this sort of analysis. But I think we also need to remember that we have to keep looking at people who are vulnerable and irrational and flawed and fearful, but also hopeful, sometimes capable of changing for better or for worse. And it may not justify some of Mr. Putin's policies, the continuation of the conflict has killed thousands in eastern Ukraine, which has turned Ukraine and Russia into enemies. But it does help explain why he reached certain conclusions, what haunts him, what shaped his fears and ambitions. So as Barry said, I interviewed him twice. The first time was in 2001 when he'd been in power just a year, and his Kremlin officials thought it would be good to make him look like a modern president who knew about the internet. So they thought if they invited a BBC correspondent, I had an online discussion program at the time, who would feed questions to him from the world, he would look really with it. They built this special studio with all sorts of special neon screens so you could see the questions scrolling through live. Of course, typically they only finished it the night before. It all smelled of fresh paint. But it did look very good. So that was the first interview, and they thought it went very well. So they invited me back 5 years later when Russia hosted its first G8 conference to do the same thing again. And it's always been very instructive to me how he changed in those 5 years. So in the first year, other heads of state have said to me that they had this experience too. So he could be really terrifying and bore you with those blue eyes. A bore in the sense of bore into you. And he was intimidating. And if you asked him a question about nuclear weapons or Chechnya, he would fire back this response, which was very aggressive. And he didn't like follow-ups at all. But in that first interview, lots of people were very curious about him because he's relatively new on the world stage. And we had quite a lot of questions about him personally. What are you reading, Mr. Putin? Or what music do you like? Or what are your favourite films? And he was a bit at sea. He wasn't used to all this. He was still a bit of a tabula rasa. He hadn't got a polished persona of a world leader ready. And they were quite revealing, especially the books. Although in retrospect, I should have paid more attention to the signals they sent of the Mr. Putin we know today. So he said, I'm reading 2 books. The first one is a biography of Peter the Great, and the second one is a biography of Empress Catherine. But in 2006, when I went back, these 2 Mr. Putins, the sort of private Mr. Putin and the public Mr. Putin, he wasn't showing in public both those sides. He was impervious, he was president of a country which had paid back its foreign debt, the oil price was high, he was back on the world stage, he had defied skeptics in the West to show that this was a country that mattered. And he was just a little bit cocky, he played games with me. At a certain point he turned the tables on me, and I asked him why could we really trust him to sell gas when he just cut off the gas to Ukraine. This is 2006. And he asked me what my pearls were worth. Not these pearls, these are worth nothing. Slightly nicer pearl necklace, which, you're not meant to do that. We were live on the internet around the world and live on Russian TV. And he really put me on the spot. I couldn't be grumpy. Well, the whole of Russia would have said, our president really upset that British Correspondent. So I had to carry on being kind of in control and light-hearted. So first of all, I said, I'm not going to tell you. And then he insisted. And then I kind of twigged that this was to do with the gas price question. He said, you wouldn't sell them to me for just a few kopecks, would you? And I realized this is all an elaborate way to say you shouldn't sell gas to Ukraine very cheaply. And so I said, I would give them to you, Mr. President, as you're the president of Russia. So I wrong-footed him back. So that was very clear. You can watch it online if you were ever to be interested in doing that. But the interesting thing about him was how much he'd changed, and you could see how the circumstances of Russia had changed him, but also given what Russia had gone through in the 90s and where I knew he'd come from in his Soviet years, you could just understand this psychological path that led him to this point. And of course, the journey has continued, and we've seen him develop too. So I've always found all those years incredibly useful for reading the politics of Russia through emotion of people, of the whole nation. The 1990s, the whole country had post-traumatic stress syndrome, let's face it, wouldn't you? If overnight your country disappeared and suddenly your pension could only buy an egg. They went through a horrendous time. I met one old lady who said she'd lived through the siege of Leningrad in the 1940s. They were all burning their furniture and eating shoe leather. She said the 1990s were worse. My husband died and my 40-year-old daughter died in my arms. You have to bear all these things in mind. But coming back to my scholarships, what I've also realized, and I realized very much when I was Moscow correspondent, was that actually those years in Soviet Russia, combing through the newspapers in old libraries, I wasn't allowed into the archives, so I read a lot of newspapers, was not just about giving me personal insights, but actually it was incredibly useful, that research, in an unexpected way. It may have had a narrow remit, but by chance, it served me very well as Moscow correspondent in 1989 because tracking the Gorbachev reforms, and we were all wondering where they would lead and whether they would zigzag or turn back on themselves or go further, you could see that they began tentatively slogans of acceleration and discipline to reinvigorate the party and make it work better, which was been Yuri Andropov's vision, the KGB chief who took over from Brezhnev, who was, just in some extent, he was the, as I've understood from Gorbachev himself, he was the man who brought Gorbachev to Moscow and elevated him to that position of general secretary. So he was at first doing his mentor's bidding. He wanted to make it work better, not demolish it, and only slowly, it was as though he began to roll back the carpet on Soviet history, almost decade by decade, rather tentatively. And this was obvious to me because I'd studied it in detail. So the first thing that happened was that they renounced Stalin's repressions, the terrible period, particularly of the late 1940s after the war. And they set up a commission to investigate those who'd been killed or sent to the Gulag, to set the record straight on that period in Russian history. Then, a bit later, they rolled it back to the 1930s, and an agreement was set to have an investigation to look again into the circumstances of the death of Bukharin, a communist leader who died slightly mysteriously in the middle of the 1930s, which was one of the events which triggered the 1937 purge of Bolsheviks by Stalin, known as the Great Terror. And then, a little bit after that, you began to notice in the Communist Central Committee statements and Gorbachev speeches that they were rolling the carpet back a bit further to the early 1930s and Stalin's policy of collectivization of agriculture, that this had been flawed, that it had caused countless deaths and deportation of many peasants, and maybe if private farming wasn't yet agreed to be the way forward, then at least there was a relaxation of the kolkhoz rules, and they were trying to look at more inventive ways to get people to increase agricultural production and boost food production in the Soviet Union, which of course had been one of the causes of the collapse which had led to the arrival of perestroika. And then the carpet was rolled back a bit further to the 1930s, to what was known as the new economic policy after the Civil War, when the Bolsheviks came in, the early years of the last years of Lenin, when they relaxed things a bit and they allowed not private enterprise, but collectives. Gorbachev did exactly the same thing. He said, we'll have cooperatives. A green light for all the black marketeers that there were in late Soviet Union, that for the first time in 60 years, they could come in from the dark side and their private enterprise was being more or less legalized. And then finally, the rollback which took perestroika to before the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917 to the Russian Duma and the first promise of democracy in the early years of the 20th century in Russia. The perestroika reforms, which were the pivotal moment of Gorbachev's evolution in 1989, when he allowed a competitively elective Congress of People's Deputies to be formed to represent all the nationalities and the entire country, with a lot of dissidents who took part in it. For example, Andrei Sakharov broadcast live on TV to debate the future direction of the country and inevitably the end of communist monopoly on power. So it's like the slow lifting of a veil on Soviet history to reveal decade by decade what had really happened under communist rule and to sort of ease the population and the party into a step-by-step regression, return to what had come before, until we know in the end the cloth was snatched away by impatient radical reformers who thought Gorbachev wasn't going fast enough. And I used at the time, as Moscow correspondent, to joke to my colleagues, well, I know what's coming next, because I studied this history going, the carpet being rolled out forward the first time round, so I can see exactly what he's going to do next. And it sort of was that, and it's interesting, and it's telling about our lack of Western comprehension of how Russia ticks, that as the years have gone on, this ability to sort of see from, because this is a place that refers back to its history a lot, that this is a very useful way to put yourself in the mindset. And it gives you an inside understanding of how these Russian politicians view what's happening and how to appreciate the internal undercurrents of a country which, for example, then had been 70 years almost entirely cut off from Western countries. Not surprising that they referred back to their own history. And that still happens. And I still think I couldn't have reported in the depth that I have without drawing on those early understandings and insights. And so actually all those years in Soviet libraries was incredibly useful in a really rather unexpected way. And I still find that I draw on this all the time. The big question everyone is asking now is, where is Russia heading? What will happen to Putin's Russia? What will happen to Mr. Putin? And more recently, I've begun to ponder on how useful is it to look back at periods of instability in Russia and even uprisings to say, well, can that help us understand what might happen in the next few years? I've thought a lot about the coup, the attempted coup in August 1991. There was an uprising in Moscow in 2011, which started as a protest against election and fraud, turned into an anti-Putin movement, which he crushed. So the question is, Arab Spring, these things spring up, could this happen to Russia too? Actually, I find using historical hindsight, I think if you think about what happened in 1991 with the attempted coup, those communist leaders who put Gorbachev under house arrest, they tried to roll the clock back and bring back communism. They neglected to arrest President Yeltsin, who was then head of Russia, and they had misunderstood that 6 years of Gorbachev telling people that they could say what they think had empowered the population to think they mattered. And so they did rush to the White House. They did defy the coup. They did respond to Boris Yeltsin, who was telling them that it was all illegal. But the key, I think, there was that they felt empowered by their leader to do that. So one of the reasons perestroika happened and communism collapsed was because the General Secretary of the Communist Party himself gave everyone commission to challenge it, thereby sawing off the branch he sat on, which is probably not his intention. But actually, in a way, that's what happened in 2011. They just had 4 years of President Medvedev, who's a much more lenient, outward-looking president, sending very optimistic signals about how the country needed to change, engage with the world, have a new generation to lead it. And I think those were people empowered by President Medvedev, however weak we think he was, which allowed that mood to turn people out onto the streets. I don't think that's there now. I don't think there's any signal at all from the top that people should be empowered to go out onto the streets. Mr. Putin has done everything he can to stop that. So therefore, the lessons of history for me of where we might see change in Russia come further back to 1985, when Brezhnev had died. They'd had a succession of 2 elderly leaders. They needed to make a choice. They felt vulnerable. They felt they needed to engage the world. They thought Gorbachev would be a good bet because he was a loyal communist, but he would still be invigorating and engage with the world. He'd been to see Mrs. Thatcher, for heaven's sake, and she'd liked him. And what they didn't realize was that he would turn into something different. Or let's roll back further still to the death of Stalin and the chaos that followed him, his death, and the gap that left, the vacuum, the very dangerous vacuum, which in the end threw up Nikita Khrushchev as leader. Who would have thought when Stalin died in 1953 that 3 years later he'd been making his secret speech and denouncing the cult of personality and ushering a period of reform, which, okay, didn't last. But those are interesting historical paradigms, I think, for thinking now what might happen if one day either Mr. Putin disappeared or those around him decided that he no longer served their interests, no longer had the confidence of the population that we've been talking about, and they needed something different. So I think we should look at their choice, put ourselves in their shoes to think what their choice would be. And then once that person were to take over, I wouldn't rule out Medvedev again, actually, because I think he'd send a huge message of continuity to a panicked population. What might happen then? That's quite interesting. So that's my little prediction for Russia. But what I'm really trying to say is that through all my analysis of Russia, and more broadly, what I lived through and saw with my own eyes as a very young person of your age, maybe a bit younger than some of you, age 19 or 20, 22, 23, 35, 40 years on, it's still the valuable, the essential bedrock of my analysis. And I think that it serves to me as a useful message of how broad we should think when we think about what might be useful later in life. Now I've left daily journalism, a new job in Cambridge. As you heard, I've been here my first 2 weeks. Master of Peterhouse. It's another way for me to give back, after all, to return to higher education, to particularly remember those experiences of my own postgraduate years and understand how important all of you are and what an important resource not just for academia and this university but the whole world, that we should cherish you, that we should listen to you, that we should support you, that we should be acutely interested in what you do next, whether it's in the academic sphere or more broadly. You are incredibly important, as are all your cohorts in this university. So that's something very important to me that I bring with me to this new job. But I can't follow the day-to-day news anymore. But I think the big thing that I do carry from my previous decades in my previous career is the importance of making sure as we nurture specialists, not just what is of obvious relevance today, but the wide range of subjects which will bear fruit and prove important for who knows what we may face tomorrow. Thank you.
Bridget is available to you after that spectacular lecture for your discussion. Fire away.
Anything, you can ask me about anything. I may not always answer everything, but you can ask me anything.
What books are you reading right now?
Oh my gosh. Well, I must confess, I'm not reading very much in the way of recreation. There's too much to absorb from my new job. But the book I have by my bed, which I think would be good, calmer, just to switch off, and I will open it, is by my old friend James Runcie, who was at Trinity Hall, and I met him. We were both trainees at the BBC together, and he's gone on to have a distinguished career as a documentary filmmaker. He ran the South Bank literary programme. He's been a director, and he is a novelist. And he has now a series of books, some of you may be aware of them, about a fictitious vicar of Grantchester called Sidney Chambers. And it's now actually also, you don't have time to watch this stuff, but it's on television. It's a series on ITV. And it's very nice. It features Cambridge. It's rather gentle. It's the 1950s. I think his father was another Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie. And I think James is quite interested in the history of the Church of England and the evolution of social and religious thought in Britain in that period from the 60s forward. So I think he had a kind of ulterior motive in writing it and exploring how Sidney, what he thought, and as he went about his daily business and collaborated with the local inspector on crimes, what his day-to-day confrontation with morality led him to. So I recommend the books, so they're on my desk, but I'm not actually reading them.
Thank you very much. This was a very, very enlightening talk. I had to ask, and this is perhaps a slightly less tactful question. I had to ask, speaking of how things are today, what are your views on what's happened in Britain over the past couple of weeks, Brexit? And do you believe that we are entering perhaps a relatively more isolationist stage where countries, where we were thinking, at least I thought, that we're entering a more global phase, but now apparently countries, Russia, Britain, in very, very different ways appear to be looking back or within themselves or retreating within themselves. What would your views be on this?
I suppose that sort of underpinned the first part of my talk, that we can understand these processes in a world which is bewildering and speeded up and overwhelming, and which some people have lost their place in, and others have benefited from. But not everyone has benefited. I mean, there's a whole new subject, isn't there, of robotization, and what that is going to do to the workplace and how we need to rethink that. So I think we have to be acutely aware of a lot of people who may feel they're losing out. If you're a Gates scholar in Cambridge, you're probably very well placed to benefit from the world and enhance it. But not everyone is. And so the question is, will this lead to overall a mood towards a battening down of the hatches, which I profoundly believe is a bad idea. There are so many positives for an interconnected world. We all know about those. Whether it's delivering medicines to kids in Africa or just bypassing governments, which might be hostile to each other, but they can't stop the people being connected. I remember once going to a prison in the middle of Siberia in a town called Tomsk. And they had quite a lot of prisons, actually. And Siberia does have quite a lot of prisons. So this was a prison for underage female offenders from eastern Russia. So basically Siberia all the way to Vladivostok. And these were all child murderers, young girls. We spent the morning with them. It was pretty clear to me most of these were girls who'd been abused in one way or another and had hit back to defend themselves. And I think most of the prison staff thought that too. But in many ways, they were just ordinary girls, aged between 10 and 14. But what was really interesting to me, again, comparing it with my Soviet experience, was that in the Soviet Union, if I'd gone to a school or actually met quite an educated person, they would have known nothing about my world. I remember having arguments with people I was at university with in the provinces in the 1970s who insisted Russia won the World Cup in the 1966. I said, no, they didn't. England did. No, you're wrong there. And the whole frame of reference. And one air hostess who said to me when I went back to a conference in 1980, she was terribly friendly, and she wasn't actually even Russian. She was Armenian. You'd thought on the periphery of the Soviet Union she might have been a bit better informed, given they have such a large diaspora. She said, do tell me, Bridget, last year, why was it the Americans invaded Afghanistan? 1979, I'm talking about. She was a decade or so ahead of her time, wasn't she? But, this was the cloistered world they lived in. But this prison full of these young girls, they clustered round, and what they wanted to know was, have you seen Harry Potter? They'd all seen it, the movies. Have you met Prince Charles? They were engaged in our world. They were the same questions that I might have had from kids at a high school in America. And that's a very good thing about our interconnected world. So there are good things as well as bad things. And if you think about Brexit, to come back to your original question, it was quite a narrow vote. I mean, you've got to, I think, look at Turkey. If you ignore the electorate, Erdogan lost an election last summer, then he had a new one and got in, and, now where we are, we've just had, a failed military coup, but incredibly destabilizing for Turkey. This is all about a government not listening. You've got to listen. And even if the result of the Brexit vote was a shock to a lot of people, perhaps particularly in the south of England, you've got to listen. You can't ignore it. And you have to find a way through it which will not let those people feel that they're being discounted by the elites again, who live in this golden world where interconnectedness is all very nice, thank you. They can afford to fly to Australia or snazzy hotels in Singapore or whatever. But think about what it means if you're living in a northern city in Britain that's seen a lot of shops, businesses closed since 2008. You worry about your kids. You don't feel that you're being listened to or benefiting. So I think, those conversations are very important. So I don't think it's a... But I am hopeful that as time goes on, as the shock... we get used to it, and now I think it's really important that there is a new government with someone at the helm who can take the lead and say xenophobia is totally unacceptable, for example. This is an open country. We are open to everyone. We benefit from the world. We want it here. We want to have links with our EU colleagues who share our values, who are part of our world, part of our same culture and broader European identity, despite whatever arrangements may be made. It's incredibly important to have that leadership. But I think also, as things calm down a bit, hopefully we can find a way through this, which may in the short term be a little uncertain and painful, but won't be disastrous. But I am also aware, I'm incredibly aware, that we live in this world, as I started off saying, of sudden shocks, which can do all sorts of things. And this has been a sudden shock this summer, not just to this country, but actually economically globally, but who knows what other sudden shock there might be, which puts it in completely different context. So that probably sounds to you like a very waffly BBC answer where I sit on the fence. I've only just stopped being a BBC correspondent, so don't forget that. But I do think that you have to think about this bigger context that we all live in, and those of us who are committed and engaged in this larger international interchange, we have to speak loudly about it and make sure that that theme is heard and appreciated. Yep.
Well, also, thank you very much. I have a question which is somewhat related to that. I mean, from all the things you've seen in Russia and also the rest of your career, what to you makes the anatomy of change? I mean, when does something turns into real change? And we saw, sometimes it's an election, but what catalyzes real change?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and very interesting. I don't know if there's a single answer. And is every incident separate and different, or can we find paradigms that are useful? I mean, as I explained at the end of the talk, I do find it intellectually engaging and perhaps sometimes useful to look for paradigms. So, 1985, 1953 for some kind of kitchen coup or change at the top that might happen in Russia. That's my kind of instinct. I could be completely wrong. I keep thinking about times when people are wrong. So in 1982, when I was saying my Russian friends thought it would go back to 1937, they looked at that paradigm. And they were wrong. They were completely wrong. And I remember my highly respected supervisor in Oxford, Max Hayward, the most marvellous expert on Russian literature, who sadly died far too young. He was the one who sent me on the course of studying Russian literature, and I remember him saying sometime in the 1970s, you have to understand, Bridget, that what's happened in the Soviet Union is they've managed to create this extraordinary construct, mechanism. It's like a perpetual machine. It's self-producing. And it's a self-producing mediocre model. So you have this Communist Party which always throws out any outliers or people with real initiative or desire to change things. They become dissidents, or they don't survive, or they don't get promoted in the system. It promotes mediocrity, people in their own model, so that this stultifying, stagnating Soviet Communist Party endlessly reinvents itself, so it never changes. And he said it could be there for your and my lifetime. Well, he was wrong, because it turned out at a certain point this self-perpetuating model no longer worked. So change came out of stagnation in that case. But also, even the cleverest people who had the most subtle understanding of Russia, and he did, could not see that coming. Or I remember in 1987, just before I went to be Moscow correspondent, I was doing a series of programs for Radio 4, which were loosely around the idea of change in 1968. And I said, Bridget, you know about the communist world, you can do Prague. So I went back to Prague, which in those days was quite tricky. It's quite hard to get visas and not easy to get to see people, quite repressive, with the Times correspondent who'd been there in 1968 to visit people he'd known. And he knew Havel, he knew Yuzhi Dinspir, another prominent communist. So we went to see Havel, who was a dissident, and he took us out to lunch. He's a bit isolated, lonely figure, living freely in Prague, but with no status, no money. And we went to see Yuzhi Dinspir, who's his friend, who was another man who's been very engaged in the whole Prague Spring experiment, and he was now a stoker. He came in his boiler suit with grubby hands. He gave me this sheaf of papers. He said, it's my vision for a new vision for Central Europe once we get rid of communism. Could you take it back to Britain for me? And I remember thinking, pie in the sky, well, I'll do this to please him, but, what an idea. But I asked both of them, we asked both of them what they thought about Czechoslovakia. There'd been Prague Spring. It was then 20 years ago. Could it happen again? And they both said, well, you know, it's very repressive now. There's been Charter 77. There was a kind of jazz movement of young people. Maybe it's the young people who are important, but probably not in our lifetimes. That was 1987-88. Within 2 years, one was president, one was foreign minister of the new Czech Republic. So, you know, how do you predict these things? How do you see patterns when even those people who are so closely involved cannot necessarily see what's around the corner? And it seems to me it's often because it's a mixture of opportunity and rational development, but also accident, you know, things that go wrong. The coup in 1991 went disastrously wrong. They didn't plan it. I think they thought, from conversations I've had with some of the coup leaders who went to see Gorbachev down in Feroz in his villa, they thought they'd present to him a case for a state of emergency. And because he was a bit of a vacillator and he's always trying to ride two horses, that he would say, well, fine, you do it, I'll stay here. And then when they'd imposed the state of emergency and kind of locked up Boris Yeltsin and dealt with the threat to the Soviet Union as they saw it from all these republics, which would, in the end, blow up the Soviet Union from within if they all got their way to be sovereign states, leaving the Soviet state with no role. And Gorbachev, as one person put it to me, is no better than your English queen. They thought Gorbachev would go along with this because it was in his interests to keep the Soviet state going. In fact, they had a big row. He said, go to the devil. And they all went back to Moscow, having a little tipple on the way, apparently. Some of them were quite heavy drinkers, and began their coup and put him under house arrest. And that wasn't the way it was meant to be. You know, that was not how they expected this to happen. So from then on, it went wrong. And because it went wrong, Yeltsin was hugely enforced. Gorbachev came back to another country. Within days, Yeltsin had banned the Communist Party. The Baltics were off. Ukraine declared sovereignty, which was virtually independence, and by the end of the year, the whole thing had collapsed. Well, could you see a scheme there that you could repeat in other circumstances? It's a lot of sort of... it's as much about things that go wrong as go right, and therefore I think often it can be quite hard to see a scheme. But it's... I can see you're not looking entirely convinced. I'm sure there are... You know, there are paradigms that you can look for if you look at it in a broad enough context and you look for enough variables. But I still think, when I look back, that I'm just not. I become less and less confident that I can be sure about where this change would come from and what are the factors which would lead to it than perhaps I was before.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Over here, Bridget.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was struck by so many of your anecdotes, both professional and social, I suppose, and one was your discussion with Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, and also something of a Russianist, I suppose. Yes. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall of that conversation, especially given his recent article on the Orwell lecture, his recent Orwell lecture on war, words, and reason. I'm also heartened by your setting out as a literary scholar. There aren't many of us here. But my question is not about literature.
What are you studying?
I'm a Joycean. This is Irish literature here. But my question's not about literature. It's really about history. You discussed, or you mentioned the importance of Gorbachev and Perestroika, and even perhaps Putin's understanding of history and willingness to willingness certainly to discuss it. And I'm not sure, but it seems to me that leaders in this country aren't quite as disposed to discussing British history and its relation to earlier incarnations of interconnectedness around the world, in debates on Syria and so on. It seems to me, in fact, that the BBC television news is rather sort of plays villains and heroes with Putin. I generally have to switch off at that point. I'm just wondering if you would confirm that, or more broadly, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how Britain's leaders discuss their history, are able to discuss history, especially making decisions, say, going to war, or really any sorts of decisions, whether you think that's adequate, and if that indeed is a catalyst for change. I'm sorry.
Well, it's a complicated question. I must say I once did have a lovely conversation with Rowan Williams about Dostoevsky, which we did for the radio. It was fabulous. I loved it. He was still Archbishop of Canterbury. Because, you know, Dostoevsky's polyphonic, and so that's quite interesting to watch a church around about a polyphonic view of the world. He said, well, it's very Church of England, you know. But your broader question about British politicians, and I think, you know, it is partly about the geography of this country, of being an island, I think, and its history, that leaders do think in terms of, and there's a national conversation here, which can, I think, you're right, it can predominate. And some other countries have more of an international conversation, a broader context, if that's what you're getting at, that there's sort of a broader context is held in mind the whole time. It's not just in terms of how this will play in Britain or what this means for our country. It might be, you know, I mean, inevitably, if you're, I don't know, Austria, you are going to think about the countries around you. You don't have a water in between. Russia's pretty insulated. Actually, Russian literature is. I was at a couple of years ago. The London Book Fair had a focus on Russia. They have a focus on country every year, and I was involved in their steering group. They brought over loads of Russian publishers and writers to try and launch, because there are a lot of very good ones, launch them on this global stage, which was the London Book Fair. They were not interested in the British reader, in British publishers. They came to London and had a conversation with themselves about Russia. So it's not the only country that does it. And I think it can be a factor of size. I mean, look at the United States. I was asking, there was a conference here earlier this week about US foreign policy, and one of the participants, well, Madeleine Albright was one of them. Another was Vin Weber, who's a very seasoned Republican former congressman, very good analyst and observer of his own country. And a question I pressed him on is, I'd asked him this, and I saw him in London earlier this summer, do you think a Brexit vote would have an impact on the election, on the Trump factor in America? And I asked him again, I said, well, right, okay, now we've had Brexit, do you think it will? No. It won't make any difference to the United States. The United States is having a conversation with itself. So I think lots of countries do that, and I think if you look at history and the geography of particular countries, you can see why some do it more than others, and I'm not surprised for a cohort who are very international in this country, that you find it a bit British. When I come back from abroad, I find it a bit British too. But I think the reasons are understandable, and not least because this is a country in transition. The Scottish referendum, the Brexit vote, the relationship of London to the rest of the country. There is good reason to listen hard to what people are saying and what's going on, the undercurrents in this country. So it is quite preoccupied with itself. I agree with you.
Okay. I think we have to end now. Is that working? I'm not sure. Perhaps you'd like to join me in thanking Bridget for just an outstanding...